Here is the actual security footage that shows the exact moment that the Georgia Guidestones exploded. Now, if you notice something weird, look at the time when the explosion happens. It's at 4:03 and 33 seconds. We all know what 33 means.
On July 6th, 2022, a bomb went off on a 5-acre farm in Elberton, Georgia, destroying a monument that had stood there for over 40 years, the Georgia Guidestones. This monument was made of 4 massive granite slabs, weighing more than 230,000 pounds, and had a set of guidelines for creating a more peaceful and organized society. For decades, the identity of the person who built it remained a mystery. Today, I'm going to tell you who that person was. But why did they want to stay anonymous? Likely for the same reason the Guidestones were destroyed. They promoted ideas like a one-world government, genetic and racial purity, and significant global depopulation, a vision of a new world order.
A unique Georgia attraction that stood for nearly 4 decades is destroyed.
Popular North Georgia monument that's been the source of a lot of speculation over 4 decades.
So, back in June 1979, this mysterious guy, dressed sharp and calling himself Robert C. Christian, walked into Joe Finley's office. Finley was the head of the Elberton Granite Finishing Company, and Christian came with a wild idea to build a monument that could compete with Stonehenge. He had just visited Stonehenge and thought it was impressive, but said it was missing something important, a message. Christian was after something much bigger, a set of rules that the whole world could live by, and his name, Christian, was apparently tied to his religious views. According to Christian, he wasn't alone in this vision. He said he was representing a small group of dedicated Americans who had spent the last 20 years plotting this huge, intricate monument. He showed up with a full-scale model and super specific plans. The structure would be 16 feet tall with 4 stones forming a cross, topped by a central stone. The real kicker, his message would be carved into the stones in 8 major languages: English, Spanish, Russian, Chinese, Arabic, Hebrew, Hindi, and Swahili. And as if that wasn't enough, it would also feature inscriptions in 4 ancient languages: Babylonian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Sanskrit, and Classical Greek. At first, Finley was skeptical. He figured this guy was probably a little crazy. But when Christian started explaining the monument's design, Finley was hooked. The stones would be massive, bigger than anything Finley had ever worked with, and they weren't just for show. Christian wanted them to function as a huge astronomical instrument, which was something Finley hadn't seen before. One of the stones would follow the moon's path throughout the year. The central stone would have a hole that always pointed to the North Star, and there'd be a slot at the top to mark noon during the solstices and equinoxes. The capstone would even cast sunlight onto the center column, marking the exact day of the year. But what really made people raise their eyebrows? Christian insisted the whole thing had to be strong enough to survive the apocalypse. By now, Finley was pretty invested. His company usually handled gravestones, statues, and regular monuments. But this was something else entirely. Finley's first thought was, "This guy's nuts. How do I get him out of here?" So he threw out a huge price, far more than any project he'd ever worked on, figuring that would scare Christian off. He explained it would take special tools, heavy equipment, and expert consultants, all of which would cost a fortune. But Christian didn't even blink. He just asked, "How long will it take?" Finley guessed around 6 months, but made it clear that he wouldn't lift a finger until Christian showed he had the funds. Christian then asked if Finley knew any trustworthy bankers. Finley's response was, "Good luck finding one." Christian laughed but went to Granite City Bank anyway, where he met the president, Wyatt Martin. They struck a deal. Martin would handle the account for the Guidestones project, but only if Christian gave his real name, under the condition that Martin never reveal his identity. Martin agreed and kept Christian's true identity a secret for the rest of his life. Once the finances were sorted, Christian bought 5 acres of land in Elbert County, Georgia, and the construction of the monument began. After that, Christian disappeared, and no one ever saw him again. The land R.C. Christian picked for the Georgia Guidestones wasn't random. He chose the highest point in Elbert County, a spot visible for miles, making it the perfect place to showcase the monument. By March 22, 1980, on the vernal equinox, the Guidestones were ready, and a few hundred people, including local media and even the town's congressman, showed up for the big unveiling. The size of the thing was impressive. The 4 outer slabs stood 16 feet tall, 6 feet wide, and almost 2 feet thick. The capstone on top stretched nearly 10 feet long, matching the width and thickness of the slabs below. Altogether, this massive structure weighed about 240,000 pounds. People from all over the world have been drawn to the Guidestones over the years, but it's not just because of their size. What really caught people's attention were the inscriptions left by R.C. Christian. He carved his own version of the 10 Commandments into the stones using big 4-inch letters. These rules, according to him, were meant to steer humanity in the right direction. Some of the key messages were things like keeping the global population under 500 million to live in harmony with nature, guiding reproduction to improve genetic fitness and diversity, and pushing for a new universal language. Other points included the idea of leading with reason instead of emotion, protecting people with fair laws, allowing nations to govern themselves while settling global disputes in a world court, avoiding unnecessary laws and officials, balancing personal rights with social responsibility, valuing things like truth and love, and respecting nature by avoiding harm to the planet. At first glance, these ideas might seem reasonable, almost like guidelines for a better world. But the deeper you look, the more controversial they seem. Many folks believe the Guidestones are pushing for some kind of new world order, promoting ideas like eugenics, mass population control, and a one-world government. While officials and skeptics often dismiss these concerns as conspiracy theories, there are still plenty of people who think the message deserves a closer look. Take the first rule, for example. It says the population should be kept under 500 million in balance with nature. Considering the world's population is nearing 8 billion, following that rule would mean reducing humanity by a whopping 94%. This lines up with ideas pushed by groups like the Club of Rome, which has been around since the late 60s. The club promotes discussions about global issues, but has faced criticism for being secretive about its roots and motives. Many think there's more to their agenda than meets the eye. In 1980, right after the Georgia Guidestones were put up, a member of the Club of Rome named Howard Odom made a bold claim. The U.S. needed to cut its population by 2/3 within 50 years. He didn't exactly lay out how this should happen, but people have tossed around different theories. One idea is that simply not having any new births for one generation could help reduce the population by about a quarter fairly quickly. Then there's the Bilderberg Group, which you might have heard of. It was formed in 1954, supposedly to prevent another world war. However, the group's secretive nature has fueled a lot of conspiracy theories over the years. One of these theories is that the Bilderberg Group believes population growth is spiraling out of control and that they might try to reduce it through things like pandemics. Another theory is that they have a tight grip on media companies, using their influence to control the narrative and censor any information that goes against their goals. While it's true that big social media platforms like Twitter have faced accusations of censorship, it's not entirely clear if the Bilderberg Group has a hand in that. The Club of Rome, interestingly, is also rumored to have a strong influence on the Bilderberg Group, especially when it comes to foreign policy. Some even say the club backs extreme population control measures. This kind of speculation gets even murkier when you consider that one of the club's founders, Prince Bernhard, was a Nazi SS officer during the early years of World War II before switching sides. Even though he later left the Nazis, that part of his past continues to raise eyebrows for many people. Despite all the theories, there are some who think the Guidestones weren't meant to suggest shrinking the current population. Instead, they might be seen as a set of instructions for rebuilding society after some kind of global disaster. One of the more eyebrow-raising inscriptions on the Guidestones is the second rule, which talks about managing reproduction in a way that improves both fitness and diversity. This idea isn't just some abstract concept. In 1986, R.C. Christian wrote a book called Common Sense Renewed, which he mailed to every member of Congress. In the book, he argued that every government needs a solid population policy. He was convinced that this issue was even more urgent than things like national defense. According to Christian, the government should play a role in deciding who gets to have kids. He believed that responsible parenting needed to take both genetics and the environment into account, with the goal of producing healthier, smarter, and more capable children who could make society better. He was all for using science and any other knowledge available to ensure that future generations would be stronger, both mentally and physically. Christian even suggested that if we had generations where families were limited to just one child, we'd see big improvements over time. He believed that people who weren't fit to raise children should be legally or socially discouraged from doing so. His thinking was that only the most suitable individuals should be allowed to have kids, which would eventually lead to a genetically superior generation. This concept is known as eugenics, and it's a hugely controversial idea. Historically, it's been linked to the Nazis and is considered a war crime, but some wonder if such policies might resurface in a new world order. The same Rockefeller who helped start the Club of Rome also founded an organization called the Population Council in 1954. This group focuses on researching birth control and early termination of pregnancies, particularly in people they believe have less desirable genetic traits. Rockefeller felt that modern society had weakened natural selection by allowing people with weaker genes to reproduce, and he thought there needed to be a way to reduce fertility among these groups. In 2020, a member of the Population Council faced allegations of supporting forced sterilization. The council is still around today and continues to run programs in various regions like Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Interestingly, they don't seem to have programs in North America or Europe. While it could just be a coincidence, the fact that their work is mainly in non-white countries has raised some eyebrows. It's also worth noting that the U.S. government is one of their biggest financial backers, contributing millions of dollars each year. Over the past few decades, global health initiatives have made a big impact. Infant mortality rates have dropped by 60%, and life expectancy has jumped from around 46 years in the 1950s to 63 years today. But with these improvements come some downsides, especially when it comes to population growth and the strain it puts on our planet's ecosystems. When you start looking at the bigger picture, the guidelines for this so-called New World Order are controversial. They include things like controlling the population, trying to create a better society through eugenics, introducing a single global language, and resolving international disputes through a world court. Some people see these goals as sinister, even linking them to the Antichrist based on warnings from the Book of Revelations. Another one of the rules calls for reason to be placed above passion, faith, and tradition, which has caused a stir among some Christians. Many people in the faith see this as an attack, especially since they believe faith should be the guiding force in life. This has led to the Georgia Guidestones being tied to conspiracy theories involving satanic rituals and witchcraft. Locals have even reported strange things happening near the stones, like mysterious lights, chanting, and melted candles. While there's no proof of any human sacrifices, a few unfortunate chickens haven't been so lucky. There are some interesting theories about the location of the Georgia Guidestones. Some suggest they were built on land tied to native Hopi prophecies, which mention a new world. Others think the stones are aligned with ley lines, similar to well-known landmarks like the Great Pyramids, the Great Wall of China, or Stonehenge. There's also speculation about a connection to the Rosicrucians, a secretive group often linked to mystical ideas, definitely something that could be explored in another discussion. But perhaps the biggest puzzle surrounding the Guidestones is, who actually paid for them? After more than 3 decades, we finally got some clues. One theory suggests that Earth can sustainably support about 1 billion people if we want to maintain a high standard of living and personal freedoms. Some argue that it would take a significant reduction in the global population to achieve this. Others believe it might be possible to support more people, but only under an authoritarian regime, which isn't exactly appealing to most. The idea here is that the population should be reduced gradually and evenly, rather than forcing drastic measures that benefit the wealthy at everyone else's expense. For years, there's been a lot of talk about who R.C. Christian, the mysterious figure behind the Guidestones, might be. One popular theory pointed to Ted Turner, the founder of CNN, given his environmental interests and his public stance that overpopulation is a threat to society. But Ted Turner wasn't R.C. Christian. Not only is Turner still alive, but according to all accounts, R.C. Christian and those closest to him have passed away. Wyatt Martin, a banker who knew Christian's true identity, took that secret to his grave after his passing in December 2021. Martin did drop a few clues along the way. He confirmed that R.C. Christian died sometime after the year 2000, and that Christian had a daughter, served in basic training in Georgia before World War II, and had some experience in construction. These hints helped narrow down the possibilities, but still left much of Christian's identity a mystery. The real breakthrough came in 2005, during the filming of a documentary called Dark Clouds Over Elberton. Wyatt Martin, in poor health after suffering a stroke, was eventually convinced to share some of the letters he'd received from R.C. Christian. Although Martin tried to be cautious, covering the postmarks on the envelopes, a camera caught a glimpse of a return address. This small but crucial detail led online researchers to track down R.C. Christian's true identity, Dr. Herbert Hinsey Kirsten, a surgeon from Fort Dodge, Iowa. Kirsten fit the profile. His last name was a variation of Christian. He passed away after 2000, served in World War II, and had been deeply involved in environmental issues and world population concerns. He also had experience in construction, just as Martin mentioned. Curiously, Kirsten had 4 children, which doesn't quite line up with the Guidestones' message of limiting family size, but it adds another layer of intrigue to the story of a man who shaped one of the most mysterious monuments in America. Kirsten had some pretty notable connections. One of them was William Shockley, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who was also infamous for his racist views and support for eugenics. Given this association, it's not surprising that Kirsten, as R.C. Christian, might have shared some similar beliefs. While the Guidestones themselves weren't openly racist, Kirsten's support for controversial figures like David Duke, a former KKK leader, definitely raises a few red flags. So for some, the destruction of the Guidestones felt justified. But does that mean the story is really over? On July 6, 2022, just after 4 a.m., surveillance footage showed someone sprinting toward the Guidestones with what looked like an explosive device. Moments later, one of the 4 massive stones was blown to pieces. Within minutes, a car sped away from the scene. Strangely enough, heavy machinery arrived almost immediately to clear the site. You'd think this would have been treated as a crime scene for longer, right? The ATF was on site quickly, but despite today's forensic technology, the evidence was cleared away fast. What's also odd is that this happened in a remote part of northern Georgia with only one road in or out, yet no one seems to have tracked the vehicle after it left. In the middle of the night, you'd expect that car to be easy to spot, but we still don't know much more about what happened. The speed of the cleanup has sparked a lot of questions we may never get answers to. Was this an act by someone who hated government policies, or maybe someone tired of the hypocrisy? Think about it. People who push for population control often have large families themselves. For example, Rockefeller had 6 kids, William Shockley had 3, and Dr. Kirsten, R.C. Christian, had 4. Yet these are the same kinds of folks suggesting the rest of us should follow population limits. Who decides who's genetically fit? The answer seems to be those with power, who build their wealth off human progress and then try to slow things down once they've secured their own spot at the top. Many of these people also speak out about climate change, fossil fuels, and pollution. They push for restrictions on our personal choices, like owning cars or using certain energy sources. But then you look at people like J.D. Rockefeller, who made his fortune from oil, or Aurelio Peccei, the founder of the Club of Rome, who made money working for Fiat, a major company in transportation and military equipment. Climate change wasn't a major issue when they were building their empires, but now it's a hot topic. It's possible the Guidestones were destroyed by someone fed up with this double standard. And while I get why people are frustrated with monuments that symbolize certain beliefs, taking the law into your own hands is still vandalism. Destroying property like this is never the answer, no matter how angry you might be. So, where do we go from here? The destruction of the Georgia Guidestones has kicked off a heated debate. Some people see it as a stand against what they view as elitist control, while others are sad to see what they consider a piece of public art lost forever. This event forces us to ask ourselves how we handle symbols that divide people. On one side, you have folks who see it as pushing back against globalism, and on the other, you have those who think tearing down such symbols only deepens the divide and creates more chaos. Ultimately, the destruction of the Guidestones pushes us to reflect on how we approach big societal issues. If we're going to tackle global challenges, we need open, thoughtful discussions that bring different viewpoints to the table. The Guidestones and their mysterious messages remind us that we need to talk about the future we want, not just destroy what we don't like. The destruction of the Georgia Guidestones also brings up a larger conversation about how we, as a society, handle symbols of controversy. When something becomes a target for public anger or represents ideas that people find objectionable, there's often a push to remove it entirely. But is erasing these symbols the best way to deal with the issues they represent? Or does it just sweep the conversation under the rug? These days, it seems like more and more symbols, whether they're statues, monuments, or even buildings, are being destroyed or removed because they're tied to complex and controversial histories. But when we tear them down, are we losing an opportunity to learn from the past? These monuments, like the Georgia Guidestones, could spark meaningful discussions, but once they're gone, that chance might be lost. It also makes us think about the power dynamics at play. Who gets to decide which symbols stay and which ones go? In the case of the Guidestones, the messages carved into stone sparked debate for decades, and while some saw them as a warning for the future, others viewed them as a symbol of elitism and control. The people behind these kinds of monuments often have the resources to shape how history is remembered, but when symbols are destroyed, it's the public who ultimately decides what gets remembered and what's forgotten. So that's all for this topic. If you enjoyed, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more.